last summer I met with Skip Rutherford, and Skip Rutherford is the dean of the Clinton School, and we were talking about speakers we could share. And Skip told me, he said, you don't have to go any farther than your campus. Go get a biology professor named J.D. Willson. And we have J.D. Willson here this evening. J.D. Willson will be talking about pythons. He is an associate professor in the Department of Biological Sciences. His BS is from Davidson College. His PhD is from the University of Georgia Savannah River Ecology Lab. His research focuses on community dynamics of reptiles and amphibians. So tonight, J.D., pythons. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Bill, for the lovely introduction. It's really exciting to be here. I really didn't know much about the Pryor Center until I was invited, and you guys really have something amazing started here, and I'm really honored to be part of it. I've been fortunate to be involved in this really, what I consider to be one of the most intriguing and challenging biological experiments really of our time. And this is the idea that we've got one of the top predators in the world, a giant snake that's been introduced from its native range halfway around the globe, and we're now trying to deal with a problem of these snakes where we don't want them. And it's amazing because this animal is one that I knew growing up from the time I was a little kid, obsessed with frogs and snakes and other creepy crawly critters. This is one that I knew from all my books, trips to the zoo, places like that. And if you had told me at that time that I would eventually be studying these snakes, not just in the wild, but here in the US, I would have said you were crazy. And it turns out that that's just exactly what I'm doing now. So my goal here over the next 45 minutes or so is to sort of give you a little window into some of the ways that I've been involved in research on these snakes, some of the projects we've worked on, challenges we've faced, and in some cases overcome, and some of the ways that we can learn a lot from this situation, both about snake biology and about invasive species in general. So for those who don't know me, I'm basically a herpetologist and conservation biologist. So that basically means that my students and I study reptiles and amphibians, creepy crawly critters, within the context of pressing conservation issues. So for example, we study things like how to balance forestry production with conservation of salamander biodiversity, how to alleviate effects of pollution from some of the most polluted sites that we have here in the country. Now in the last 10 years or so, I've become involved with this sort of intriguing issue of invasive species. And this has, in some cases, really caused me to sort of shift the paradigm of how I think. And I like to start a talk about this by sort of noting that I've had to sort of turn my whole way of thinking upside down, because I've really dedicated much of my life to advocating for these animals and teaching people about why you would want snakes around, why we should conserve their populations, why they're important parts of our ecosystems. And here I am now trying to use that knowledge of snake biology to get rid of snakes from a place where we don't want them. I think we should be careful to remember here that the fact that these snakes are causing severe harm to our ecosystems really isn't the snake's fault, right? And my goal here isn't to vilify or demonize these animals too much. They're just doing what they're evolved to do. They're evolved to be a top predator and a really adaptable generalist species. And the fact that they are where we don't want them is really our fault, not theirs. So I think that's important to keep in mind along the way. So we're probably all familiar with the idea, the problem of invasive species. This is really second only to habitat loss in terms of the way, the number of species that they threaten and how they impact our threatened and endangered species. We can probably all think of great examples ranging from species like the round goby, zebra mussel, and Asian carp in the Great Lakes and the Mississippi, through some of the invasive types of vegetation like kudzu, purple loosestrife, or Brazilian pepper in Florida. Even some of our sort of beloved household pets, if they end up in places where we don't want them or if they become feral, can have really severe effects on native species. But among the slew of invasive species, there's really few that have gained as much attention both from the broader public as well as the scientific community and the media as this species here. And this is the one we're talking about today, the Indian or Burmese python. This is a species that ranges across much of Southeast Asia, all the way from very dry regions of Pakistan, India, and even the foothills of the Himalayas in Nepal, all the way across through southern China and into tropical regions of Thailand and other parts of Southeast Asia. These animals have been really popular in the pet trade for decades, and that's not surprising. They're beautiful, I really can't overstate the value of these animals as teaching tools and their role in inspiring young scientists and wildlife biologists and managers. It's a large part of what got me headed on this track as a kid. They do really well in captivity. When they're small, they're relatively easy to keep. They're big, they're bold, they're beautiful. They reproduce really well in captivity, so they've been captive bred and sold in huge numbers for quite a long time. And all these traits make them basically very desirable as pets. And in fact, since the 1970s or earlier, it's been possible to go to almost any pet store in the country and pick up a cute little baby Burmese python that looks like this, fits in the palm of your hand, and you can set up in a nice 10-gallon aquarium on your dorm room shelf or in your living room, show off to your friends by feeding it mice, parade it around the dorm room. The problem is, a couple of years down the road, you're stuck with an animal that looks like this. And unfortunately, this is an animal that's really beyond the scope of most casual owners to really take adequate care of, right? This thing is an animal that needs a lot of space, needs very particular temperatures and humidity conditions, eats things like rats and rabbits, and really outside of zoos or really serious hobbyists, this is not an animal that most people are able to take care of. Unfortunately, that means that people don't want them when they get big. And the sad fact is that most zoos and animal parks have all the pythons they want. They're not going to take any more. And unfortunately, that means that many get either intentionally or unintentionally released into the wild. And the end consequences of this have been establishment of an invasive population of these snakes in and around Everglades National Park in Florida. How many people have been to the Everglades? Good, maybe half the room. If you haven't been, you should go there. It's really one of our ecological jewels of this country. It's probably the biggest true wilderness area left in the eastern United States. Thousands of square miles of sawgrass, mangrove forest, lots of unique and interesting species. And since about the early 2000s, people started finding snakes like this showing up, especially in the southern parts of Everglades, down in the mangroves and saline glade regions near the port at Flamingo. And at first, these were basically curiosities, right? Everybody's excited. It was fun to take pictures and send them around. But the general consensus was that these were animals that had been recently dropped off or released, and that they were unusual, but nothing to be really concerned about. Unfortunately, once they started showing up and people started looking, it very quickly became clear that these were not all wild snakes. In fact, we had an already reproducing and established population in Florida. And very quickly, we started finding juveniles. And as soon as we started looking, we started finding even females nesting in the wild in Florida. And this is a female that was actually found in the wild. They lay very large clutches of up to 80 to 100 eggs at a time. And unlike most snakes, the female actually stays with the nest and guards it during incubation, which of course probably dramatically improves hatching success. Since their sort of recognition as being established in the early 2000s, the number of python encounters increased rapidly. And some of this was due to just more people looking, but certainly more and more snakes were being found, to the point where for the last 10 years or more, hundreds have been removed per year from the Everglades region. And if you know where and when to look, it's now not uncommon to come across a site like this. This is actually how you see most pythons. I'll talk a little bit later about how good they are at hiding. So actually the way that most casual observers see them is when they come out to cross a road. And this is not an uncommon sight in the Everglades. This is a picture that I particularly like, taken by a buddy of mine. This is a python naturally crossing the road at night, right at the main gate of the entrance to Everglades National Park. Of course, they get big. I mentioned that these are one of the largest snakes in the world. Depending on whether you're talking about length or mass, they're probably top 3. And they get big in Florida, too. And in fact, over the last several years, basically every couple of years, we come up with a new biggest snake caught in Florida. Currently, the record's held by 2 individuals that were between 17 and 18 feet that were caught back in around 2012 or so. Just look at the scale of these snakes. This is an animal unlike anything that's lived in Florida in recent history. And they really dwarf our native snake species. So these are the 3 largest individuals of our 3 largest native snakes in Florida: the eastern diamondback rattlesnake, indigo snake, and coachwhip. And they really don't even hold a candle to a big python. So not only have these snakes increased in numbers, but they've also increased in geographic range. And this map actually, it's a beautiful map, but it's now pretty out of date. They're now found certainly throughout most of the regions covered by this map. They were first found, as I said, down in the southern part of Everglades in the mangrove forest near Flamingo. As soon as we started looking within the next few years, we realized that they were actually spread over most of Everglades National Park. And now they're found well north of Alligator Alley. Determining the exact extent of the invasion is tricky because they're hard to find, but there are records from all the way up near Lake Okeechobee. And for those who don't know Florida, you should just take note of the scale here. This is a massive scale. We're looking at essentially a map of Florida, and the area now occupied by pythons is something on the order of 4,000 to 5,000 square miles. Most of this habitat in here is almost completely inaccessible. This is mangrove and salt marsh and sawgrass and places that you can only go in an airboat or a helicopter. It's another way that these snakes actually differ from many other invasive species that we typically deal with. If you think about things like feral cats or hogs or even coyotes, many of them are sort of affiliated with human-altered habitats, and they're often subsidized by our garbage and other activities that we use to disrupt the environment. These pythons, the core of their range seems to be in the most remote areas of Everglades National Park. So as I said, I've been fortunate to be involved in python research basically from the very beginning when we first realized that they were established. And I've been involved in many different ways. And my goal here today is going to be to walk you through a few sort of case studies of research projects that we've done. But before I do that, I should thank the many people that have been involved in this research. I'm going to try to focus mostly on my own research and that of my students, but it wouldn't have been possible without lots of people on the ground, especially collaborators at the Park Service, University of Florida, USGS, and others. So the first sort of topic that I'm going to talk about is one of the earliest projects that I did related to pythons, which was some basically computer modeling work trying to understand the progression of the invasion and use that to understand how we ended up with this situation. What were the situation that sort of led to establishment of this species in the US? And of course, one of the main reasons you guys are all here tonight, this issue of python snakes sort of invokes strong emotions, be it positive or negative, across the board. The media loves stories about big pythons. And one of the things you'll see across much of the media coverage is tremendous amounts of misinformation. This is a great example here of a cover story about pythons with the wrong python species on the cover. This is actually a carpet python from Australia, which is much smaller and, of course, is not as established in Florida. One of the topics that the media likes particularly to dig into is the idea of how these snakes got to Florida. And in fact, you'll hear thrown around in article after article after article the idea that this whole situation is a result of Hurricane Andrew. Hurricane Andrew was, of course, a massive hurricane that hit South Florida in 1992. And it makes for a nice story to say that this storm swept in, destroyed a giant reptile warehouse or breeding facility, and spread these snakes out into the Everglades. Makes for a good story, but up until we started working on this, there essentially had been no rigorous evaluation of whether the data actually support this idea of where the snakes came from. And of course, it matters also in terms of what we might do proactively to avoid a situation like this happening in the future. So we attacked this problem basically by creating some population models, and I'm not going to get bogged down in math here, but basically what we do is we take biological information about the snakes, things like their survival rates, their rates of reproduction, their rates of maturation, and we can put these together and project how quickly populations might grow. And so the way we use this was to basically back calculate. If we assume that at the time we did this study, we had at least 10,000 snakes in the wild, we could backtrack when they were likely introduced based on sort of best case scenario, how fast the population could grow. These are some figures from that analysis. Basically what we did was we simulated several different scenarios, introduction of just a couple of founding individuals, introduction of 100 or 1,000 founding individuals. And what we basically did was match up how quickly populations could get from introduction to current perceived population size of greater than 10,000 animals, and especially how that compared to the timeline of Hurricane Andrew, which at the time we did this study was 16 years previous. And basically what we can take home here is that if you start with just 2 founders, just a small founding population size, it takes almost 30 years for the snakes to get from just a few individuals up to the population sizes that we think we have currently. And in fact, in order for Hurricane Andrew to be the source of this, we would have had to start with hundreds to thousands of founders initially starting the population. We also match this up with evaluation of the spatial patterns of where pythons have been found over the course of the invasion. And particularly we were interested in, were pythons centered around the southern part of Miami, Homestead, and Florida City, which is the area where we would have expected a breeding or holding facility to be located. Turns out the pattern is exactly the opposite. As I mentioned, snakes were first found way down here in the southern part of Everglades. That's where reproduction was first confirmed, and that's where these snakes were most common during the early years of the invasion. And if you look at the scale again, we're talking about 30-plus miles between the area where snakes were first found and where any kind of breeding facility would have been. So the idea here is that if you put these two together, in order for Hurricane Andrew to have caused this problem, we would have had to have the hurricane essentially transport hundreds to thousands of snakes from this region over 30 miles out into the heart of Everglades and have the snakes successfully establish here without establishing in the intervening habitat. And so to us, this just really doesn't match the data, right? A much more plausible, parsimonious explanation is that these snakes probably started from just a few individuals down here in the southern region, and they were probably there much, much longer than we thought. And in fact, I'll present some data in a minute about just how good these snakes are at hiding, and it's likely that these snakes remain undetected as a slowly expanding population for years or even decades before we realized that they were established. If we comb really deeply into the literature, we can even find a few sort of vague anecdotal references of pythons being seen in the southern region dating back to the 80s or earlier. And so put all together, this really suggests that Hurricane Andrew was not the root of this problem. This was probably one or a few probably well-meaning but misguided pet owners, and I'll let you decide if that's a misguided pet owner or not, who dropped off or intentionally or unintentionally released snakes down in the southern region of Everglades, probably in the 80s or maybe even earlier, and that it took time for these snakes to become established and their populations to start to grow. There's another take-home message here too, which is that because these snakes can remain undetected so long, we really need to act proactively whenever we have any evidence that these snakes might be becoming established somewhere. There were years where snakes were being found in small numbers and nobody really cared about it. And in fact, if we want to stop a scenario like this from happening again, we need to be proactive in taking action early. Luckily, Florida, including the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission and Everglades, has a very active program to encourage responsible pet ownership and discourage release of captive animals. And so hopefully this is heading towards the direction of avoiding another python introduction or an introduction of another species. So the second sort of set of studies I'm going to talk about, which is the core of my talk, is on the impacts that these snakes are having on our native species in Florida. Sort of giving you the history of the invasion. Now we're going to talk about how they're actually affecting the ecosystem. So the first step in understanding their impacts is, of course, figuring out what they're eating, right? And this has been a goal since almost day one of python research. Almost every python that's brought in from southern Florida gets humanely euthanized and thoroughly necropsied and examined by scientists. And often this allows us to identify whole prey items like this opossum or partial prey items or remains like this bobcat claw from snakes that are euthanized. In addition, we occasionally find snakes out there actually in the act of preying on native species. These are pictures taken by visitors to Everglades National Park of snakes constricting white ibis and great blue heron. From these data, we've amassed a really massive database of python diet records. And it basically seems like they feed primarily on warm-blooded prey, mammals and birds, but that within these groups, they'll eat almost anything that they can catch. And so among mammals, their diet ranges from everything from small rodents up to large bobcats and deer, and including species that are rare or endemic, such as the endemic round-tailed muskrat, Key Largo wood rat, of which there are only 200 left in existence, and it's a federally endangered species, or the big cypress fox squirrel. Another one I'll point out, although it's tempting to go to the extremes of size or perhaps difficulty to capture like a bobcat, but one that I always sort of gawked at was armadillos. And I always thought that the idea that an animal like a snake could capture, kill, and eat whole an armadillo must be one of the most amazing feats in wildlife. And I challenged my colleagues that I really would love to see this happen. And sure enough, a couple of years ago, a buddy of mine sent me a picture of one of the snakes that they were tracking out in the wild in Florida in the process of swallowing an armadillo whole, which just sounds like an amazing meal to try to put down. Note also that this is a wild snake in the wild in Florida, and you've got people's houses right on the canal right behind. So these are snakes that are actively integrating into the matrix of habitats in South Florida. Among birds, again, very diverse diet, especially the larger Martian wading birds, herons, egrets, ducks, and some of the really iconic birds of Florida like the spoonbill, wood stork, and limpkin. But they'll eat almost any kind of bird. In addition to the warm-blooded prey, we're finding they actually quite frequently consume American alligators. This is a picture taken by a tourist at night along one of the visitation trails in Everglades of a snake naturally constricting a mid-sized alligator. This is one that you may have seen that made the rounds in the media quite a bit after the pythons sort of early in the invasion. The history of this photo, it's often portrayed as a hoax. It's not. This is a snake that was located, actually spotted from a helicopter of a biologist flying out over a remote part of the Everglades. This is a big snake, about a 13, 14-foot snake. It had eaten about a 5 or 6 foot alligator, clearly suffered some injuries and died soon thereafter. And as the bodies decomposed, gases built up and the alligator sort of exploded out of the side of the python here. But clearly they're capable of taking down even mid-sized alligators. Just to give you an idea of what they're capable of, this is a large female that was captured north of Everglades a few years ago. It had quite obviously eaten a relatively large prey item. And when we cut it open, we found it had eaten basically a full-grown white-tailed doe, about a 70-pound deer. So these snakes are really capable of eating almost any of our native species, especially the warm-blooded mammals and birds. So we knew they're eating a diverse array of prey, especially mammals and birds. The next question that we really sought to answer was, when we know they're eating them, are they eating enough of them to have an appreciable effect on their populations? And so we set about several years ago basically asking that question, if there have been changes in mammal populations associated with python invasion. And to answer this question, we focused on mid-sized, what we would call mesomammals, such as opossums and raccoons. And there were a couple of reasons for this. First, we knew that these were species that pythons often eat. But probably more importantly, we actually had some historical data for these species in Everglades National Park, which is sort of a rare thing in science to be able to retroactively compare data that you wouldn't have thought to collect before. The reason we had these data is because one of the best ways to catch snakes, including pythons, is to drive roads at night and look for them crossing the road. And in fact, we had a colleague who had spent hours and hours and hours driving roads looking for snakes in the Everglades prior to the python invasion. And he was keeping track of mammals. He actually kept detailed notes on what mammals he saw when he was out there. So we had historical data from the southern part of Everglades where pythons have been established the longest. We supplemented this with extensive data from post-invasion. These were data that we collected ourselves and with colleagues. We also sampled 4 sites that were recently invaded or where python populations were thought to not be as high. And we sampled 2 sites that were in similar habitats outside of the python's current range. Jumping to our results here, I've got our mammal species across the bottom here. And this is just an effort-corrected index of how many we saw, how many per 100 kilometers. If we look at the mammal community prior to the invasion in the 1990s, this is that historical data. We see what I would consider to be a robust and fairly typical mammal community. Remember, we're driving roads at night, so we see things like raccoons and opossums all the time, fair numbers of rabbits, deer, bobcats, things like that. I'm going to pop up the data from post-invasion. And I'll highlight here that we drove almost 57,000 kilometers on these roads in Everglades using exactly the same methods. And we saw a total of 5 opossums, 9 raccoons, and no rabbits or foxes during that whole period of driving 57,000 miles. So it's spooky to drive these roads at night and not be seeing things like raccoons and opossums running across the road. These represent declines of over 85 to essentially 100% in some of these species. Our surveys were not particularly good at detecting rabbits because they were at night, but I'll say that essentially rabbits have not been detected in the southern part of Everglades now for almost a decade. If we look spatially at our other sites, if we look at peripheral sites, we have sort of intermediate mammal abundances. And our extraliminal sites outside of the Python range have many mammals, especially raccoons and opossums, and are pretty similar to our historical data from the Everglades. So we've basically got patterns both over space and over time that suggest that mammals have disappeared from the Everglades, sort of coincident with pythons expanding in the region. So at this point, we've documented that pythons eat a diverse array of species. Our data suggests that they're pretty severely negatively affecting many of the mid-size and large mammals. And in fact, I'll say that since our study, several other studies have backed up these same conclusions in terms of the disappearance of mammals from the Everglades. There was one particularly interesting study where they actually tried to reintroduce rabbits to areas where they had been wiped out. And basically, the rabbits failed to fully establish, and the primary source of mortality was predation from pythons. So this strongly suggests that we're seeing pretty severe effects of pythons on many of our mammal species. Now, of course, playing the devil's advocate, we might say that almost all these species are relatively common species. We're not particularly concerned about things like raccoons and opossums. But to me, this is a sort of more fundamental warning that they're probably starting to fundamentally change this system. And you might imagine that loss of these mammals could cascade through the food web and through the ecosystem and change the whole way the system works. And so if we start thinking about what we would call indirect effects, that is, effects that sort of trickle up and down the food chain, we might expect things like the loss of rabbits negatively affecting predators like bobcats and Florida panthers. We might expect that some species would be positively affected. And so in our next goal was to look for evidence of these indirect effects. And the system we chose to focus on were freshwater turtles. And we chose them for a couple of reasons. One, this was a pretty obvious indirect effect because one of the primary sources of turtle mortality is egg predation by things like raccoons and opossums. So we predicted that in places where raccoons and opossums have disappeared, we'll actually see a positive effect on turtle nesting success. Of course, also turtles are an integral species in the Everglades. This is one giant wetland, and it's full of turtles. So we went out with the idea to try to evaluate, are we seeing effects on turtles, even though, as far as we know, pythons don't eat turtles at all. So we did this basically taking advantage of the same spatial pattern that I described before. We had sites located in the core areas where pythons have been established the longest, sites in more recently invaded areas, and sites that, at least at the time, were thought to be outside the range of where pythons have spread. There are now pythons showing up in these areas, but this was a different time. And at these sites, we created artificial turtle nests. So we went out and we found areas that we considered to be likely turtle nesting habitat. We dug a little hole and buried 4 quail eggs in a hole, covered it up, and we scented it with a little bit of water that turtles had been soaking in for several hours. We did this because when female turtles nest, they generally release their bladder on the soil to loosen the soil before they dig. So we essentially scented these artificial nests to smell like a turtle nest. On each of these nests, we put a game camera, a wildlife camera, that was designed to automatically take pictures of any wildlife that came by. So first, we can look at our mammal observations on these wildlife cameras, and we basically see a pattern that virtually identically matches our data from the road surveys, right? We see very few mammals at all in the core areas where pythons have been established the longest, intermediate numbers of mammals in areas that are recently invaded, and large numbers of mammals, especially raccoons and opossums, in areas that had yet to be invaded by pythons. Of course, picture's worth 1,000 words, so I'm going to give you a little slideshow of what it looks like to look through these camera photos. So we're starting with the extraliminal sites with no pythons. Lots and lots. I mean, some of these cameras were visited multiple times every night by mammals. Here's a raccoon digging up one of our turtle nests, possum running by. Actually, we had lots of bobcat observations on these cameras. They were much more common than you would think they are. That was pretty exciting. We even detected some marsh rabbits, which, as I said, have been eliminated from the southern part of Everglades. Our peripheral sites were kind of similar, still fairly reasonable numbers of things like raccoons and opossums. In the drier, higher ground areas, we had quite a few deer. Here's a raccoon digging up one of our turtle nests. We even had some sightings of some pretty exciting megafauna, Florida black bears, and even several records of Florida panthers, which was really exciting. These are the last remnant of wild mountain lions that survived in the eastern United States. At our core sites where pythons have been established the longest, again, it was kind of spooky. We had lots of pictures of wavy grass at night. The odd bird, I think crows were our most frequently observed animal in at these sites. We even had, this is a soft-shell turtle. We had some turtles come up and nest in our nesting areas, so we obviously chose good turtle nesting sites. But mostly, it was really kind of spooky. Very, very few mammals, as we would expect in these core areas. If we jump to the results of our nest predation study, so what we're looking at here is the timeline of our monitoring of these nests. We monitored them for 2 weeks, and we scored predation from no predation with a 1 to complete predation up here with a 5. And what we saw is that these core sites had very, very low rates of predation by mammals. Compare that to our uninvaded sites, where we have almost complete nest predation of our turtle nests. And this is actually pretty characteristic of turtle nests. In some cases, mortality of turtle nests due to things like raccoons is upwards of 80 to 90%. So through this study, we basically detected the first evidence of indirect effects of pythons, so an effect on a species that's not directly consumed. Now again, we saw a positive effect, right? This is good news for turtles. But to me, again, this is a warning that they're starting to change this whole food web, and that some of these indirect effects, which can be convoluted and difficult to predict and understand, are probably starting to manifest. And this pattern is particularly troubling in light of the other really well-known snake invasion in the world. If you're not familiar with this critter here, this is the brown tree snake. They were introduced from their native range in New Guinea and Australia to the Pacific island of Guam, which is a US territory and a large military installation, back in World War II. This situation is in virtually every biology textbook as a classic example of a damaging invasive species. They quickly overran the island and basically wiped out all of the native birds and many of the lizards and even some of the small mammals. And so that was bad, right? We like birds. There were some species that occurred there that occurred nowhere else that we were worried about. But as the data have continued to pile up over now half a century or more of the snake being in Guam, we're starting to see how this snake is changing the entire island. There's some recent studies out that show that tree species in the forests are changing because there's no longer pollinating and seed dispersing birds to spread their seeds around. And so some tree species are completely disappearing. Spiders have exploded on the island because there's no longer birds eating insects, and so spiders have become the top insect predator, and spider abundances in Guam are off the charts. So a situation where a snake has totally changed the ecosystem of, in this case, an isolated island, but we're seeing patterns begin to emerge in Florida that show sort of an eerie parallel to this brown tree snake situation. So the final piece I'm going to talk about today is some of our sort of current and ongoing research. And this is aimed at a particularly difficult question, that is understanding how many pythons there are out there. And of course, you know, this idea of how many pythons are there sounds fundamental, and it is. But shockingly, it's one that we really haven't been able to adequately address thus far. You'll realize that we need to know how many are there to really have any degree of certainty in how successful any kind of control measure is being. Likewise, we need to understand how many there are to understand why they're having such severe impacts on mammals. Is it just that there are so many pythons, or are pythons on an individual level really superior predators to the native species we have? And shockingly now, 10 plus, getting on 15 years into the invasion, we have essentially no idea how many pythons are actually out there. And we know we've removed large numbers over time. The total number removed is up in the several thousand range now. but we have no idea how that relates to how many are out there, other than that some areas where we've continually removed large numbers continue to have snakes. And to drive this point home, a little anecdote, we were sort of tasked a couple of years ago with coming up with a phrase that Everglades National Park could put out to the media that had something to do with how many snakes were out there, because in the absence of a statement from the park, they were grabbing numbers out of thin air, essentially. And after days of discussion amongst all the biologists and managers, this is what we came up with as the best thing that we could really put our confidence behind, and that is that there are currently up to 100,000 or more pythons in the Everglades, which of course means absolutely nothing, right? So this is really challenging. The primary reason that we don't know virtually anything about python abundance is that the traditional technique for estimating abundance of wildlife populations just doesn't work with pythons. And this is a technique known as MarkRecapture. We basically go out, catch animals, mark them, release them again, sample again, and look at how many are marked versus unmarked as an index of how many are out there. And this doesn't work for pythons for a couple of reasons. First, this is a damaging invasive species, so we don't want to be releasing large numbers of them back into the wild when we do finally get our hands on them. Second, and probably more importantly, these snakes are so good at hiding that even in cases when we've had marked animals out there, we have never recaptured enough of them to make any meaningful conclusion about how many there are. In fact, there's about a 10-foot snake sitting right in the middle of this picture, just under a little bit of pine straw, and you'd never know he was there. So to sort of drive this point home, we did a little short-term study, actually quantifying detectability of pythons. This was done in a snake-proof enclosure in South Carolina where we were already conducting other research on these snakes. And so we basically had an enclosure that was probably about twice the size of this room, 100 feet by 100 feet, looked like this. We had 10 snakes that ranged from about 5 to 12 feet in this one enclosure. We had 19 people come in and try to search for these snakes. And these are mostly trained herpetologists and snake hunters who, I'll tell you, every one of them was sure they were going to find them all when they went in. Anybody who's not in my lab have an idea of how many they found? Throw out a number. None. Not bad. So we had essentially 190 opportunities, 10 snakes by 19 searches. 2 snakes were found in this enclosure. So walking around in this simplified habitat, you walk right by 99 10-foot pythons for every one that you see. It's amazing. These snakes are masters of camouflage. So because we know that these traditional methods for abundance estimation just don't work with pythons, we've been starting to think outside the box and try to come up with ways to estimate how many snakes are out there without needing to recapture individuals. And the place we've been focusing on, as I mentioned before, is on road surveys. I said before that this is one of the best ways to catch many kinds of snakes. And in fact, herpetologists love to go do this. They love to go out and drive all night long and catch lots and lots of snakes. And this is the best way to catch pythons, at least in the summer when it's hot. Unfortunately, these kind of data are seldom used in any kind of quantitative way as an index of population size. And so we were sort of tasked with developing a method to extrapolate the number that we see crossing roads to how many need to be out there on the landscape. We were lucky to receive some good funding from the Department of Defense through their resource protection program. And we developed this technique actually based on a rare threatened native snake that had similar detectability issues. So I'll give you sort of a cartoon to show you how this works in theory. Basically, we drive around at night, look for snakes crossing the road, and through large amounts of efforts and systematically sort of stratifying our surveys, we come up with a long-term observation frequency of how frequently we see snakes crossing the road. And the idea is the more snakes you see crossing, the more snakes should be out there on the landscape. But what we don't have is that correction factor, right? What's the relationship between those two variables? So to get that relationship, we basically need 2 pieces of information. First, we need to know how likely it is that a snake out there on the landscape is going to cross while we're out there surveying. And then we need to know if it crosses, how likely are we to actually encounter it? How likely are we to catch it? So we sort of come at this from 2 different directions. And this is sort of a novel approach to estimating abundance. First, we understand movement of snakes, and we do this through a technique known as radiotelemetry. This is where we essentially surgically implant a transmitter that allows us to track the snake whenever we want. We track them on a frequent basis, and that allows us to calculate metrics like how frequently they move, how far they move, how they orient towards different aspects of the landscape. We use this to build computer simulations that basically allow us to simulate movements of many, many snakes across the landscape and calculate how frequently they cross roads. So this gives us our missing piece of information on how likely it is for any one individual to cross per unit time. Finally, to figure out detection probability while crossing, we actually went out, stayed up all night long, found snakes naturally crossing the road and timed them to see how long it took them to crawl across. And we can do some probabilistic modeling based on how fast the car goes, how much ground we cover, and how long the snake is visible on the road to determine how likely we would be to encounter it as we're driving back and forth along the road. So we put these things together. This is our sort of case study of that rare snake from the southeast. This is called the southern hognose snake. We were lucky for this species to have substantial existing data, both movement data from radiotelemetry as well as road capture data. And this allowed us to basically develop this relationship between how many snakes we see on the road and how many are out there on the landscape. And we use this to generate the first density estimate that's ever been generated for this species, and estimated that there are about 44 per square mile in their prime habitats in North Carolina. So we're currently applying this approach to pythons. We're lucky also through the years to have extensive data on road crossings as well as spatial movement data and telemetry for pythons. When we finally get to our answer of how many there are, this is going to be fundamental information for determining how effective our management efforts are. We have other groups working on things like traps, detector dogs, and other ways to catch large numbers of these snakes. We need to know how many there are to know if these things are being effective and to know how much effort we would need to reduce their populations. Finally, these abundance data are going to also help us understand impacts with the idea that we can assess whether it's just the sheer abundance of pythons that's causing them to severely affect mammals, or whether there might be aspects of their biology on an individual level that make them particularly effective predators. And some anecdotal data suggests that there probably is evidence for this factor to be happening too. If we look at the sort of life history of pythons, we see that they're able to grow much more quickly and reproduce at much higher rates than our native snakes. Even species like the eastern diamondback rattlesnake that are also eating prey like rabbits and living right alongside pythons. So another active area of research that we're pursuing is really thoroughly understanding this complicated process of predation and seeing whether pythons are better at encountering prey, capturing prey, or consuming and processing and digesting prey that might give them an edge over our native predators, especially our native snakes. So all in all, I hope I've given you sort of an overview of some of the really exciting aspects of python biology, some of the real challenges that we face, both studying snakes as well as studying pythons in particular. And it sure seems like these snakes are here to stay in Florida, and that more broadly, snakes as a group of animals probably have some traits that make them particularly effective as invasive predators. And especially when we consider these parallel cases of the brown tree snake and the python, it's reason to think that snakes are something we should be more broadly concerned about. Now, on top of that, many of us may not be familiar with the fact that we actually have several other incipient snake populations that are seeming to be established and are probably starting to follow the same trajectory. In fact, we not only have Burmese pythons in South Florida, but we have a smaller population of African rock pythons, which are the sister species to Burmese pythons that are established outside Miami. We have populations of boa constrictors, again, a small population in a sort of confined park area in Miami, but invasions of boas on many of the Caribbean islands, including Cozumel, Aruba, St. Croix, and Puerto Rico. Even some of our native snakes in the US, these are two water snake species that are actually found in Arkansas, and both of them are established as invasive species in California and Arizona, where they threaten native fish and amphibians. And finally, this is my favorite. We've recently figured out that there's an invasive snake problem on the Canary Islands off the west coast of Africa. And these are sort of idyllic tropical islands. It's become fairly clear that they have a problem with invasive snakes. And when we look at them, it turns out that these snakes are none other than California king snakes. which are a native US species that's widely kept in the pet trade. In fact, even in the wild in the Canary Islands, we see many of the color morphs and patterns that are popular in the pet trade. So all in all, I hope I've impressed on you just how challenging this situation is, but some of the important obstacles that we've overcome, things we've learned, and ways that we can use these situations both to prevent this from happening elsewhere and in the future, as well as to more broadly understand the roles of snakes as predators. And of course, as probably every biologist will say, every one of these studies I've done has definitely raised more questions than it has answered. And I'm sure you all have questions too, so I'd be happy to take any questions as we finish up. Got one? Oh.
I'm not sure if this was, I'm reasonably certain you didn't really have the technology to do this when you were dealing with the Burmese pythons, but for in other cases of invasive species, has genetic testing and estimating the genetic diversity of captured snakes, has that been something that's been discussed for determining initial population?
Yes, and actually there's a group from the USGS that's been strongly involved in that, and I think they actually just had a couple of papers come out that finally addressed sort of characterizing genetic diversity. Basically across the board, it's a relatively homogeneous population, so again, this supports the idea that they were probably started from a fairly small founder population, but there seem to be genes representative of various localities in their native range, including some that they characterize as Indian python genes, which are from what some would be considered to be a different species or subspecies, which occurs further west in their range for the most part. Yeah?
So do you know how the Arkansas water snakes got to California?
Presumably it's also the pet trade. Water snakes are not particularly well known for being good pets. In fact, I've worked with water snakes extensively, and they're amazing, wonderful animals, but they're not nice. And they don't make particularly good pets. They're kind of messy, and they don't tame down very well. The thing about water snakes is they're easy to catch. And so for decades and continuing to this day, you can get wholesale collector lists where you can buy water snakes for $5 a piece, order them through the mail, and get them really cheap. So water snakes have been widely available, sort of wholesale, collected from the wild for long periods. And it's actually not surprising to me that people might release them after they get them as a pet because they don't make particularly good pets. Yeah?
How far do these snakes travel in your studies?
On an individual basis? Yeah. So that's actually been one really interesting aspect of our movement analyses, at least in the core of Everglades. And we have to remember that this is somewhat of a unique landscape because it's, for the most part, a uniform sea of sawgrass. And they actually move quite long distances. In fact, our data suggests, at least in some cases, the high numbers we see on roads are due, at least in part, to the fact that they move around a lot. And they don't seem to maintain as tight home ranges as many other snakes do. So for instance, if you looked at rat snakes or rattlesnakes out in the woods here, they have a very discrete home range that they know very well. They come back to the same trees over and over again to feed or hibernate. At least in the core of Everglades, these pythons seem to wander widely, and that's especially true of males who are out searching for females, so on the order of many kilometers. In fact, there's a really neat study that sort of, it was almost an accident that it happened. When we first started tracking snakes, and this wasn't me, this was University of Florida and other folks, they first wanted to study them with radio telemetry, and the Park Service said, we're uneasy with you releasing snakes back into the park. This is when we didn't realize just how many there were. And so we're going to require that you release them way off in wildlife management areas fairly far outside the park. And they did that. They translocated them, in some cases, tens to 50 kilometers or more away. Turns out those snakes came right back to where they were from. Almost exclusively, they came right back. So they certainly have very sophisticated spatial navigation capabilities and are capable of navigating on the landscape at a very large scale.
So can you tag the rabbits in the areas that they are not in now so that you can determine when they're coming?
That's actually something that's been talked about frequently. I mean, it very well may be that in areas of low density, putting a radio collar on a rabbit may be the best way to detect a python that's there. People are thinking about another technique that's being thrown around a lot is called eDNA. This is environmental DNA, where you essentially sample soil or water and try to detect traces of DNA from whatever your target species is. There's lots of challenges, and it's a relatively new method, but I think that may be our best bet at detecting them at the outskirts of their range where they're very uncommon, maybe getting DNA in water samples. Of course, that doesn't help us catch them. It just tells us whether they're there or not. Yeah?
I'm curious to know how far north you think they're going to go. Will they get to Arkansas?
How far north I think they're going to go? I'll tell you what other people think. So this has been a $1 million question for quite a while. It was the source of quite a bit of controversy, especially soon after they were established. The primary technique that's been used to try to assess how far they could spread is this technique called climate matching. Basically, this is where you take locations where they're known to occur in their native range, and you project where those similar climate conditions occur in their potential invasive range. There have been several efforts to do this. The first one, which was also the simplest, basically included temperature and precipitation without too many permutations. Basically suggested that pythons could occur throughout the whole southern third of the United States. That's kind of scary. We did a subsequent study, actually that enclosure study I was telling you about, where we actually brought some to South Carolina and tried to overwinter them. Those ones didn't make it. It was the most severe winter in recent history in South Carolina. So there's some reason to suspect that this might be overestimating their range. There have also been mortalities in Florida during severe cold events, but of course, many snakes have survived those events too. Other modeling efforts using sort of a more, I don't want to say comprehensive, but much more complex modeling procedure have predicted smaller regions of potential suitable habitat. Most of the predictions that I would consider credible include most of Florida and at least the Gulf Coast. Of course, this may depend a lot on how much variation there is in their native range and how those genes from where they came from translate to where they are now, as well as their potential to adapt to climate here. And in fact, you consider snakes of all species are well adapted to surviving cold, and all it takes is a tweak in behavior that makes them go down a hole when it gets below freezing that would prevent them from expanding further north. So I don't know. I think only time will tell to some extent, but I think this is certainly not an Everglades problem. This is at least a South Florida or Florida problem, and probably something that the Gulf Coast should be worried about as well.
Great, thank you very much. Well, JD, we have a few gifts for you. David Pryor was in the house today, and he signed a book for you.
Oh,
his autobiography.
Thank you very much.
And then we have a Pryor Center crystal paperweight.
Very cool.
And the staff and I talked today, and we were deeply concerned. We didn't have your narration to go with. Here's the box. So we got you a very special gift because we were worried about your well-being. A Pryor Center machete.
The first thing.
First, right? We have a special tonight, 3 Pryor Center machetes for the price of 2. If Susan's right, it fits any decor. Just think on the nightstand near the back door to let the dog out, and then that trip between the car and your front door. So enjoy your machete. So, thank you very much.